With that, I will pass this over to Ashley to get us started. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Joshua. Hi, everyone. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation presentation. I plan to just kind of go over our co-authored chapter, but feel free to drop things in the chat if you want to add questions or comments. I'll try to take a look at those as I can, but it would be nice for it to be an interactive conversation. And I think I'll have about like 20 to 30 minutes of presenting, might not even be that long, and then we can open it up for a larger dialogue. So I will share my screen here. All right, so here is the PowerPoint slides. If there's any issues viewing that, just let me know. As Joshua mentioned earlier at the welcome, I think that both of us were honestly in different places and spaces when we were initially drafting this chapter. And so you may notice with some of the language, but also just some of the framing, and I have kind of pushed on that a little bit as well. But initially our chapter was entitled Confronting Hate, Addressing Crimes, Incidents, and targeting QTPOC communities. And so I'll speak larger about, kind of where we were drawing from. Currently, I am an assistant professor at Providence College. And so at the time, I was actually a graduate assistant working with Joshua in this work. And so it's just also very interesting to just see how this work has progressed for myself as well. And so I do just want to kind of hold space and acknowledge a lot of the violence that is happening and permeating throughout society and our current world. And I do want to acknowledge Black life. Although Black, queer, and trans folks have been centered at the forefront of Black Lives Matter and other organizing movements, I would like to acknowledge that they also feel a deep level of exclusion, or that their lives and experiences with violence are not also centered. And so I would like to hold space for all Black lives that have been lost in the midst of various pandemics and within the past year and over hundreds of years. I would also kind of like to take a moment to reflect on the reason that we are all here today and understanding violence, and the violence that happens and that manifests within our society against by QTPOC individuals. I'm not remiss from also acknowledging that we have witnessed many incidents of anti-Asian violence, of anti-Black violence, anti-Indigenous violence, and anti-Latinx violence throughout the society. And I think that our understandings of how we come to know this violence is not just rooted in racial oppression, that is also tied to gender, to sexuality as well. And so I also want to acknowledge and uplift that as we begin this conversation. And so given that, this chapter in particular focuses largely on hate and bias within higher education. But again, I tend to speak about violence and experiences throughout the larger society. And so feel free to bring that into this conversation as well. But our focus on this chapter in particular is through the lens of higher education, college campuses, and through the experiences of faculty and staff, but most importantly, through the experiences of QTPOC students on campus. And so where we enter into this work, it was back in 2016 where I served as the graduate assistant to the Hate and Bias Committee at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so Joshua also served on that committee and was also my supervisor at the time. And this is where we kind of came into getting to know what hate and bias work looked like on college campuses. We worked throughout the state of Wisconsin as well, and we're able to collaborate and connect with other individuals. But I think within our work, we experienced a lot of challenges, and specifically in dealing with the difficulties of language and categorization of violence, specifically as it relates to hate versus bias, implicit bias versus hate, right? Thinking about explicit bias, and even if we should use the language of bias in the first place. And so I understand how this idea of bias, whether it's explicit, implicit, and hate crimes, hate incidents, is rooted in violence, and how oppression can become re-embedded in our efforts to care or to create change. And so I think at the outset, this committee was created, and obviously so, because the institution did care, because there was an effort to want to create change on campus, for QPOC students and for our students of color at large. However, a lot of the struggles that we had with naming the incidents that were occurring in an effort to try to make those things visible, they oftentimes created more harm and created more violence when we weren't explicit about what it is that we were talking about, and when students didn't feel like they were being seen, that they weren't being heard, and that they were just continuously experiencing these hate incidents on campus. And so I think it's important. It was also important for us to understand who the victims were in this case. And so each semester, I would develop a report for the committee to see how people were being impacted. We had a reporting system. And so it was really important for us to create this reporting system in which students could report these things and let us know what was happening to them both on and off campus. And so I would look through all of those reports each semester and try to draft up to see what was happening, but also who was most impacted. And largely, it was women of color and LGBTQ students of color on campus. And so obviously that triggered myself, that triggered Joshua to really look further, not just for the purposes of this book chapter, but also on campus to understand what was happening, why was this violence constantly being perpetrated against these individuals and in this way. And we also recognize the limitation within the quote unquote legal process and protections for defining hate crimes. And so something that's so important to understand is that the ways that institutions operate have a direct impact or are deeply reflective of state and state legal mandates. And so in the state of Wisconsin, there were certain protected identities and there were others that were not recognized. And so when we were doing this work to determine how would we categorize these incidents, for some individuals based on identity, because the state wouldn't recognize it as a hate crime, that would leave us with a difficult situation of having to just falter to the language of incident instead. And as we know, a hate incident does not meet the level of a hate crime. And so when we think about justice and however justice may look or feel for certain individuals, that became very difficult and very tricky. And so when we think about the definition of a campus hate incident, a lot of institutions across the United States use similar language, but this was just one example based on the University of Wisconsin-Madison's definition when we were there in 2016. And I'll read this out loud just for accessibility. And so it says single or multiple acts towards an individual group or their property that have a negative impact and that one could reasonably conclude are based upon actual or perceived age, race, color, creed, religion, gender identity or expression, ethnicity, national origin, disability, veteran status, sexual orientation, political affiliation, marital status, spirituality, cultural, socioeconomic status, or any combination of these or other related factors. And so really important in here is that we recognize gender identity or expression, which was not recognized within the state legal mandate. And then we also try to include the language or a combination of these identities because, which I'll get more in depth, it's important to acknowledge that these incidents don't just happen because of a person's singular identity. And then further, we try to describe bias or hate incidents, which would include slurs, degrading language, epithets, graffiti, vandalism, intimidation, harassment towards a targeted individual or team. Incidents of bias or hate contribute to hostile campus environments and can occur if the act itself is intentional or delivered as a joke, prank, or humorous intent, which was also important because we know that even within legal systems, there is this difficulty or challenge to decide whether or not what the person did was intentional before it could be intentional against their race, their gender, their sexuality, before it can be deemed a hate crime. And so, just really grounding this chapter, and at the forefront, I do talk about intersectionality because of our understandings of intersectionality, but also misunderstandings. And I feel like it's truly important that we understand intersectionality, both in theory and in practice. And so, a lot of times, just like the language in the incident mentions, right, like we have race, we have religion, we have gender, we have class, but we don't have these things operating and happening at at multiple times, right, at all in one, right? And because we know that identities are all encompassing and that they do not operate singularly, right, it's important to understand how both our theoretical understanding of identity, but also in practice, right, in our work, how do we incorporate intersectionality to fit the needs of individuals, and also to for individuals to receive justice, as in this case. There's the danger of the additive approach. And so we talk about that in a chapter in which we approach things thinking about, oh, okay, she's Black, a woman, queer, Muslim, etc. We look at identity as these singular issues, but we don't understand that experience all at once, happening and operating at the same time. And then something that's very central to intersectionality is understanding the embeddedness of structural oppression, right? So, because a person may experience a hate incident rooted in their identity, it's important for us to also understand how our systems, our structures, our policies, and our practices also embed, re-embed, and reshape, right, these structural experiences. So, anti-Blackness, right, and anti-queerness, right? These are deeply embedded within our institutions, which were created to exclude, right? To be anti our identity. Drawing on queer theory, it's important to understand our obviously our identity and how it should also be problematized, and also understanding how to problematize that in our work. So when we say gender expression or gender identity, that has to be in a non-binary perspective, right? Like we can't expect that all incidents that be brought to a level of a hate incident or a hate crime is based on the standard normative westernized problematic understanding of gender identity, for example. Then it's important to understand the racialized nature of identity for BIQTPOC individuals, and how racism and anti-Blackness, anti-Asianness are always already at play, right? And so understanding how queerness becomes racialized through all of these different identities, et cetera. And then something else that was important to acknowledge was anti-discrimination law, and anti-discrimination law for whom. And so when we talk about these hate crimes, hate incidents, and bringing things up to the level of legal statuses, Kimberly Crenshaw has already talked to us about how anti-discrimination law does not keep in mind our identities at the intersections, right? So she talks about how Black women were not able to receive justice because there were Black men present in the workforce, which got the diversity credit, and there were white women, which got the gender diversity credit. And so Black women didn't necessarily have the case. And we know that to be true in our quote unquote protected classes, and how they do not account for intersectional oppression, and these experiences of intersectional violence as well. So then what is justice if we don't account for gender expression, and only sexuality, or don't account for racism, etc.? And I also posed the question, what are the deep limitations of achieving justice for BIQTPOC individuals experiencing hate crimes, and what should justice look like moving forward in this work? So just some trends and impacts that I'll briefly touch on from the chapter. So the reality is that hate crimes and incidents create and shape and maintain hostile campus environments. A lot of the individuals mention this fear of physical safety or experiencing physical assaults on campus, regularly hearing derogatory remarks or jokes regarding sexual identity, observing anti-LGBTQ campus climates. In Rankin's study, they mentioned that 41% felt that institutions did not adequately address issues related to gender and sexual identity. And 43% felt that curriculum did not also represent LGBTQ people's contributions, right? So not only being silenced in curriculum or in practices on campuses, but also in your daily experience of just existing. Even more important, there is little information available about how race and queer identity intersect in the research on hate crime. So thinking about how BIQTPOC individuals are more likely to experience negative campus climate than their white counterparts does not suggest that white, queer, or trans folks are not experiencing that violence, but that people of color are experiencing it at large. Overall, larger impacts on mental health and wellness. And I think this is important to also think about in the context of this current moment when we are in a pandemic. Most things are happening virtually. And we know that in person, this violence has manifested, but how is it maybe existing within our meetings and our Zoom conversations, right? Which also have the greater impact on mental health and wellness, lower self-esteem, depression, helplessness, fear, internalized hate or devaluation of self. Further examination is also needed to understand how racism and sexism overlap with queerphobia and heteronormativity as well. And lastly, there's no one single way that BIQTPOC individuals experience anti-queer violence, right? Like we can't just put everything in a box and suggest because these are your identities, this is what the violence looks like. These differences in the research suggest that they exist based on gender, based on race, based on gender expression as well. And so just to kind of get close to wrapping up, some initial recommendations at the time of writing, and I specifically put that in there because my approaches and my understandings of things have obviously shifted and changed. But at first it was police training and acknowledging that police have a role in perpetuating violence against BIQTPOC communities as well, but trying to develop some kind of training, cultural awareness, because we know that they exist on our college campuses. And I'll kind of bring that out a bit more on how I feel in the current moment. Something else had to do with counseling resources and trying to embed resources that can speak to the experiences of being a person of color and being queer, trans, across the spectrum of gender as well as sexuality, being able to address those needs, being able to address those experiences on college campuses. And then also understanding deeper our intersectional approach, which I feel like I've touched on a lot here, but also just thinking about how do we continue to advance that in our practice, right? Once we have an understanding of it theoretically, what does it look like in practice? And how do we also add that structural component? So how do our own office spaces, how do our own policies and practices that we engage in and act. I'm a college professor, so even some of the standards around teaching, right, are inherently oppressive and structurally so. So how are we shifting those practices to be more intersectional? Things to consider today. So in the current moment, again, as I mentioned, what I thought a couple years ago, I feel very differently about today. And so I think it's important to honor queer-led movements that ask us to defund and abolish police and prisons, especially in the current movement to remove police from schools, and that would include college campuses as well, to embed more restorative, transformative justice approaches, because we know that queer and trans folks continue to experience violence at the hands of police at some of the most alarming rates. And so I think there is a huge tension and contradiction to ask that they just see us. It's not enough for them to just see us. It's more important that we are seen, we become legible within these spaces and places. What then does that mean for justice and accountability for queer, trans people of color facing violence on college campuses and within the larger society, right? So I think we have to think about justice, we have to think about accountability, and we have to think about the law. We have to think about legal practices on a larger scale, and how we re-embed those within our practice on campus. What does BIQTPOC liberation look like in theory and in our daily practice that allows us to detach from these criminal justice systems thinking about the power of language in describing and defining violence on our campuses. And so initially in this chapter, I noticed moments where I was describing things as microaggressions, and to minimize it to the level of a microaggression when it is truly violence that is causing harm. I think it's important for us to explicitly define and describe things in that way. And then just suggesting what is the pathway forward, relying on the voices and narratives of BIQTPOC individuals is only one way that we can continue to do this work. And I will open it up for questions and dialogue here. I'll stop my screen share as well.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I appreciate you so much. And I know that you and I probably haven't even talked about this chapter or this work in the last couple of years. But I think the things that you hit on are so meaningful. And, you know, y'all, as Ashley shared, we were in the thick of this 4 or 5 years ago at University of Wisconsin. And I think we both moved on to other campuses, and this is still such a large part of our lives and our work and why we're here today. So, and I fully agree with all of the updates and comments that you made around how perspectives and ideas have evolved with this too. So thank you for your wisdom and for presenting this today as well. I have reflected so much on this in the work that we were doing. And also, you know, I feel like I hope I've grown a lot as a professional and an advocate for this too. And so, but y'all, Ashley was doing so much amazing work as a graduate student at University of Wisconsin. And this is hard and really heavy work. And I appreciate you so much, Ashley. And you were the front line talking to students who experienced this. And I know that that was a hard job. And I know that I'm sure I didn't do nearly enough to support you in this work too, in the emotional impact of it. So I appreciate all of that you have gone on to do and continue to do. We do have some questions. The first question asked, are there best practices for serving QTPOC students in higher ed that are benefiting from the data on SEL and school climate currently being collected in K through 12 systems? I'm not sure if you have an initial thought on that one, Ashley. I'm not sure if I know what SEL is. If Dave, if you could explain that a little bit more. Dave, you can feel free if you're comfortable taking your mic off and asking and expanding on that question too. We have a few minutes. I'll say from my perspective, I'm not super familiar with the K through 12 data collected on social emotional learning. So, and I would say that this is from my perspective as a higher ed administrator, as well as someone who is moderately involved in some aspects of research around LGBTQ plus or QTPOC folks. I don't think we do a great job of looking at K through 12 and applying it to higher ed. I think there's definitely a gap there, that we kind of live in two different worlds. And I think that some folks are pretty good at that. But I would say in general in higher ed, we stick to our own kind of pieces with that as well. So another question coming in, what are some actionable steps that we can take to get campus officials to respond to the violence on campus and actually make changes in policy that will help our BIQTPOC students feel safe, supported on campus? My office has lots of good conversations and are aware of some of these issues, but how do we move people to action? Ashley, I'm not sure if you want to start there and any comments.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm just rereading the question. I feel like when we were doing the work, myself and Joshua included, I feel like we just did not stop sharing the experiences of students, but then also ourselves. And again, it was that emotional labor, but we just did not allow that silence to manifest. And again, we continuously pushed on the language, we pushed on policies, we pushed on how this work was operating. Because I felt like too, when we were doing the work, we had this reporting system, and it was like, okay, great, we have a system in place. We're going to hear from students. We're going to get to understand people's experiences. But after a while, students didn't feel like it was as effective. And so they just stopped reporting to a certain extent, or weren't reporting at large. And so, because they didn't feel necessarily heard, like they would talk with somebody and then didn't feel like the actions were meeting up. And so I think that just continuously advocating on behalf of students, but also drawing in on that student voice. I think that it's most important that students kind of lead the path to tell us as well, like, how do we do this work? What would you like to see? I think sometimes as administrators, as professors, we can get caught up on like being the experts and having to have all the answers, when we have the students right there who can tell us what it is that this campus needs to look like, and allowing them to lead us into that path of making those policy changes and demanding that those things happen. And I tend to take more of an activist orientation. So I use the language of demand, and continuing to be in their face and not being silent, not being quiet, but really doing so, but also knowing that it can be a huge task on students as well. So that's where we have to kind of put ourselves on the line and take that risk. That's like my most immediate response, Joshua. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I mean, I fully agree with that, Ashley. I think that this is such a difficult place to be in. I have been in multiple roles related to this and at multiple campuses, and it is a challenge. I think in every time I've shown up at a campus, this is something I've tried to advocate for. So probably for my last 3 or 4 colleges, and most of the time it's not successful, and that's what's really sad for me as an individual. I also think, and I try to advocate to my senior administrators and legal counsels and things like that. And it often doesn't go the way I hope it does. One thing that I've been trying to do, and anytime I'm in front of an audience, so this is in front of my board of trustees, in front of my president, and I'm giving a speech, I want them to know that this is a real issue, not just for our students, but for everyone a part of the campus. So I have pushed myself to be vulnerable and to talk about the hate crimes that I've experienced myself. And that's been hard to do, but also I feel like it's my responsibility to our students to model that, like, I have been violently attacked because of my gender expression and sexual orientation. And I've always been a little ashamed to talk about that, where I had been hospitalized in a homophobic attack, and I never felt comfortable sharing that with folks. And at some point, I got so upset with my senior administration not allowing us to even collect information or have a reporting system or put things into policy, that I was like, this isn't like this silly little thing that we're talking about. This is like people's real lives. And I'm modeling this, and I'm in a position of power at an institution. Can you imagine what our students are experiencing when they don't have this platform or connections to presidents or legal counsel? So, and I think that that's one of the things, as Ashley was talking about, reflecting on this chapter. And that was 5 years ago we wrote this. And I've given up hope a lot of times too, and then I have to re-energize myself and find new ways to still stay in a system that I know is not created for us, and push for change, and find little nuggets of hope in there too. I'm an educator, and this is where I choose to put my passion as a social justice activist and advocate, but many times I lose hope with that too. And so I know that's a long answer. I would say some specific actions include students. And, I think that when I've seen action take place, it has been where there's students being active and petitioning for things. It's when faculty have joined them. It's when other administrators have joined them. It's when media has been involved before. Many campuses will pay attention to this as well. And so it takes a collective group to get any kind of push to go with that as well. Our institutions in the United States were created on white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism, and anything that attacks those things will get squashed. And so it has to be powerful, unified, collective to see something come forward with that as well. There's a lot of questions in here. I'm really sorry. I'm going to try to get to one of them. I know that there's been many things coming in. One question that came in is, your research exploring the overwhelming burden of having to teach and train the very population that are inflicting violence. We continue to run into the problem of having to solve a society that sees BIQTPOC people as the problem. Since there's no way to force or enforce humanity of perpetrators of violence, what are some subversive actions that you recommend for someone without the title to implement programs?
Yeah, I think immediately it comes to that collective piece. So that Joshua was just talking about. I don't think any of us can do this work individually ever, because we have so many institutions at large, but then also individuals that will continue to resist and come up against us. And so I think just trying to build as many connections with as many people as possible. Like even as a graduate student, I had people that I know I could go to. I could go to Joshua. I've had a few other people in different offices that I could go to and band together with, in addition to other students. Even now on the professional side, like I have people that I know I can connect with. I will also advocate like reaching out and staying in conversation, communication, and in the work with community organizers, community-based institutions as well too. I think we can get a bit caught up in our bubble in institutions, in spaces of research, and we oftentimes leave out our communities who are doing this work as well. And so building those connections that are external from our institutions and our universities, and when the demand like continue to be pushed upward, right, up that hierarchy, it's oftentimes very difficult for people to deny the responding to it at the very least. And so, as Joshua mentioned, I've seen a lot of action take place because even at UW-Madison, we had individuals in community-based organizations come into campus, banding with students, banding with faculty, and demanding action as well too.
Thank you, Ashley. We have one last question, and then we're going to need to wrap up. The question is asking, what advice do you have for QT BIPOC staff that are always asked to lead these conversations or be the first responder if something happens around hate incidents that involve your own marginalized identities?
Um, yeah, so I think that it's a lot because being the first responder on top of experiencing all of the violence yourselves, plus being triggered by the things that the students are experiencing as well. Like we run that very interesting line of wanting to be the support, but then also continuing to face and suffer from these experiences ourselves. And so I think the advice that I have is to, if you choose to stand in that role and try to be an advocate in that way, is to just make sure that you have support for yourself as well, whether that's internally or externally, because it does get very heavy and it is very difficult and it is very challenging work that I saw take a toll on myself and Joshua as well when we were doing that. I don't know if you want to add anything, Joshua.
Yeah, this is a great question and things that I've thought about a lot. And um, I have grown for myself as a manager and a supervisor because fortunately and unfortunately now many times I'm supervising the people who are on the front line supporting the students. And so I would say, one, communicate with your supervisor around your emotional impact with that as well, and with your colleagues. And so there's this great book written by Rob Brown, Shruti Desai, and Craig Elliott called Identity Conscious Supervision that I highly recommend. I've learned a lot from it as well. And if you're recommend it to your supervisor maybe. And because I know I've messed up in the past too, when I've supervised folks and I haven't provided the emotional support or being attentive to their humanity with that as well. But I would say, something with being direct with what you can do and not do. And I think that it's a check-in with yourself too, because sometimes I haven't been well and I've still showed up in those spaces to support students because I knew it had to be done. But I think of one example when I was the director of an LGBT center and I was leading a restorative circle based off of 2 hate crimes that happened to queer femme men that were violently attacked. And I was expected to facilitate that restorative circle. And it was too hard for me at that moment. I was still trying to process my own trauma. And it just hit me really hard. And I was not in a space that I could lead that circle. And fortunately, my assistant director was there. And I said, can we take a 5-minute break? We took a 5-minute break and I huddled with her and I was like, I'm just not in this space. I can't lead this right now. I need to step out. And she showed up for me. It was what I needed in that moment. And so I'm so fortunate that I had a colleague like that could step in and support me in that place. So making sure you have that in your workplace. And if not, find strategies for that as well. Another example is that I hope in this space, if you don't have those people on your campus, that you can find people in spaces like this. And so another example, in the last year, it's obviously been a really hard time with racial violence. And so Gabe Javier, my colleague, who's at University of Wisconsin, they didn't want to put that burden of facilitating a non-Black POC space in dialogue after George Floyd was murdered. And so Gabe asked me if I would be in a place that I could host that space so they didn't have to put that burden on someone at their multicultural center at UW-Madison. And so I was in a space and I was able to do that. And so I would say finding outside folks. So you could tell your supervisor, I would love to do this right now emotionally. I don't think I would be the best fit for it. Can we outsource that? I have some great colleagues that I can do that with that as well. So I highly encourage you to have those plans set in place because it's a lot. And I think that if those of you who are in higher ed, student affairs, DEI work, people don't last very long in these fields. And that's why we see such quick burnout is just because it's too much. Like you just can't live this life every day, experience this trauma and be expected to show up for students and employees. We are humans. We all have our own trauma. And sometimes we just have to kind of leave it there. And so I hope that answers the question. I know that this 40 minutes went by really fast. I want to thank you all for showing up here today and engaging in this conversation and such wonderful questions as well. I want to thank Ashley, Dr. Ashley Smith-Purviance for being with us today. Just so y'all, if any of y'all are at AERA, Ashley has 3 presentations there as well. And so this is part of Ashley's virtual conference tour. So thank you for making space to be with us today. Also, at my college, we brought Ashley last year to do some workshops and training specifically around supporting Black women and girls in higher education in K through 12. So I definitely endorse that fully. And so thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ashley. And we will see you in the next session.
All right, thank you.